Lucien pressed the bone-handled quill harder than usual, then paused as the tip struck a thick blot of ink and blood on the page. Suspicion tightened his fingers before the villager's shout reached the doorway. "Lucien, what have you done to our child's name?" The man demanded, breath steaming in the candlelight. The quill trembled in Lucien's hand. The ledger lay open, the baptismal entry half erased where a fresh smear crawled across the surname. The immediate problem stood plain. A parentage line had been overwritten, a father's name crossed out and a new, blank line cut in its place. He kept his head lowered. He lifted the quill and tapped it twice on the ink, stained inkwell, a small, controlled motion intended to steady his voice. "Monsieur Cavill, your paper is torn, Lucien." He folded the corner of the page with 2 precise movements and slid his spectacles down his nose to inspect the damage rather than the man. The villager slammed the torn piece of parchment on the desk. "Don't lie to me. My wife held this when she left the church. It had his name. Now look." He pushed the half-burnt certificate toward the candle. Blood darkened the new strokes on the page. The air smelled of wax and rain carried on the draft from the courtyard. Lucien felt the first real shift. Suspicion gave way to fear. His hands tightened around the ledger's spine, and he thought of the brass seal in his pocket. He thought of the quiet meetings in the back room of the registry, and the way names had slipped from ink into erasure in the last year. He had learned a pattern. He had obeyed it. "Lucien," the villager said, voice low and dangerous, "you will not make my child a nobody. Tell me what you did." The name of the child was Teen. The name of the parent Lucien had removed belonged to a grazier who had recently refused a tithe to a local matron. Words became currency. An erased line could be a sentence. Lucien inhaled. He pushed his spectacles back up and laid one ink-stained finger on the ledger. "Monsieur Cavill, the parish can verify," he began. He chose the slow calm of a clerk who had practiced placating the furious. The villager cut him off. "You changed the record. Give it back, Lucien." He leaned in until Lucien could see the wet thread of a recent wound at the corner of the man's eyebrow. Lucien noted the wound because details steadied him. His throat worked, and he remembered counting names in the ledger the way some men counted rosary beads. He had been counting the wrong names. The courtyard door banged. Rain beat a steady rhythm across the cobbles. A tall woman stepped into the frame as the lantern light caught the brick. Madame Viral filled the doorway the way a chisel fills a stone niche, deliberate, immovable. She smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes and folded her hands over a bronze amulet. "Step back, Jean Cavill," she said. Her voice was low, theatrical, but controlled. She let the syllables fall so that Lucien could feel the command pulse through the room. "There is an order to registration, and a line we must keep. Bring that to me, Lucien." She did not ask. The sentence functioned as instruction. Madame Virel's arrival changed the rhythm. Suspicion shifted to obligation in Lucien's chest. He felt the old compulsion return, the ritual sequence he had been taught. Ink, seal, marginal sigil, erasure. Her hands were steady. She moved toward the ledger and laid a finger near the crossed out name as if comforting a wound. "Lucien," she said quietly, "do what you were taught. Preserve the cut. Preserve the renewal." Her words were doctrine, and they carried the weight of the cult's idea that some inheritances were contamination. Lucien bowed his head. He tore a thin slip from the ledger and placed it on the desk, then used the quill to blot the wet strokes until they smeared and became illegible. He worked with a series of small mechanical gestures. Blot, fold, press the brass seal on the margin. His fingers retained the memory of each motion. When the villager demanded the original register, Lucien could only offer the sheet he had prepared to show that the clerk had recorded a correction rather than a forgery. The villager shoved the paper back. "That's not the same. That's not ours." He glared at Madame Virel. "Who are you?" he asked. Madame Virel's face did not change. "Madame Virel," she supplied, and then turned to Lucien. "Finish, Lucien. Complete the erasure sequence." She counted the names on her fingers without looking up, moving them with the care of someone weighing grain. Lucien's mouth was dry. He reached for the small brass seal in his waistcoat pocket, feeling the cold metal imprint his palm. He thought of the ledger as a mechanism, pages, entries, stamps, rather than as records of people. That mental substitution had been his protection. But when the midwife arrived, the ledger ceased to be a mechanism and became a ledger of lives again. She pushed into the doorway with a lantern held high. Her name was Margaret. She set a small scrap of paper on the table and tapped it with the heel of her hand. "This was in the margins of the delivery note for teen," she said. "It says the father's hand steadied the mother at the birth. He signed his mark." She peered at Lucien. "You know how I write. That mark is mine, not your hand." Her voice pinched on the last word. Madame Viral's fingers flexed around the amulet. "Let me see," she said. Her hand closed over the scrap, and the light of the lantern shone on a faint smudge of charcoal and an abbreviated name. She frowned for the smallest instant and then resumed the placid mask she kept for others. The scene shifted again. The suspicion that had been in Lucien's chest lengthened into a new edge. Doubt about the integrity of their selections. If Tyne belonged to a family that mattered, erasing that child's name risked exposure. The midwife's scrap introduced a variable that Madame Viral had not anticipated. Madame Viral's voice became businesslike. "We will verify the mark," she said. "Lucien, come with me. There is work to do." She guided Lucien out into the rain, slick courtyard, her cloak heavy with beads of water. The villager followed, shouting that he would bring the parish if his child's name was not restored. Outside, Madame Viral moved with practiced authority. With a single curt sentence, she redirected the crowd and then spoke to Lucien in a tone that softened just enough to be dangerous. "You were chosen for this," she said. "You understand the theology. You know why some names must be cut." Her voice made the ritual sound like preservation rather than theft. Lucien felt a new shift, from fear into a brittle compliance. He obeyed because it kept him inside a pattern where mistakes could be explained as doctrine. He obeyed because when he refused, Madame Viral could erase him in return. She had said as much in a whisper the week before. A registrar who betrays the ledger must expect to have his ledger burned. He had folded that warning into his sleep. She led him to a narrow back passage beyond a false panel in the registry. Lucien recognized the seam in the wall by the flaking plaster and the faint scent of beeswax. He pushed and the wood gave way. Behind it lay a room lit by a ring of candles and lined with shelves of folios and registers. The air tasted of vellum and damp glue. Two acolytes watched as Lucien entered. They pressed their lips together and did not speak. Their eyes tracked his movements. One held a candle wick alight with slow, deliberate care. The other closed the door and pressed a damp cloth into the seam so that the rain noise vanished. Madame Viral arranged a sequence of pages on the table and handed Lucien a fresh quill. She pointed to a list of names and instructively tapped the marginal sigil that indicated a sanctioned erasure. "Begin with the children born in the month of Saint Martin," she instructed, "then proceed to the third family on page 27. Replace parentage with the mark. Seal each page with the bronze." Her voice held the cadence of a liturgy. Lucien set the quill to the first page. He worked in measured strokes, each erasure a small physical act. Scrape the ink with the edge of a knife, dab the wound with a cloth, draw the new line, press the seal. The acolytes watched and kept time in the quiet way of people who attend ritual. Their presence was a pressure on his shoulders. His hands shook once when he reached the infant's name that matched the torn certificate. He closed his eyes for a fraction and remembered the villager's face. He could not let the memory of that anger flood him into refusal. His breath became a series of timed measures. He forced himself to continue and, in doing so, he performed a moral fracture. Obedience over conscience. Halfway through the sequence, Margot thrust a tiny folded scrap across the table. "This contradicts the register," she whispered. "Look, a midwife's mark. A signature that predates your correction." Her fingers tapped the ink where an old notation rested. The notation mentioned a landed family by name. The ink there was older and darker. Madame Viral's expression tightened for a single breath. For the first time in the room, she showed impatience. "Find the page for the elder Riviere," she ordered, voice clipped. "If their child appears, we will amend the list. If not, burn this scrap. Lucien, now," she pointed sharply. Her manner pulled the duty from him like a hook pulling a cloth. Lucien's heart lifted and then fell. The scrap implied a link to power. If Riviere's line appeared untouched in the register, the cult's calculus would be at fault. Yet the very presence of that scrap also threatened Madame Viral's control. Exposure could topple her plan of selective severance. He turned the pages. Candlelight glinted on pressed seals, names blurred into each other. He found the Rivi re-entry and his finger stopped on the margin where a faint stamp matched the matron's symbol. The entry had been altered weeks earlier. The original parentage had been replaced with the cult's mark. Lucian's pulse quickened. The midwife's scrap contradicted that erasure, but the marginal stamp testified that someone had finalized the change. At that instant, the courtyard doors crashed open. A group of villagers surged inside, rain soaking the hems of their coats. Jean Cavill led them, flanked by two others carrying torches sputtering with wet flame. They demanded the original registers. Their voices filled the room with a new kind of force. Collective ownership turned to fury. Madame Viral stepped between them and the shelves. "You cannot take these volumes without proper cause," she said. She kept her voice steady, but her jaw tightened. She counted names on her fingers again, slow and deliberate, and then addressed the crowd. "Present the parish confirmation, and you may inspect the ledgers in the presence of an official. Until then, leave these registers undisturbed," the crowd shouted back. Jean Cavill pushed forward. "We will not wait for your permission. Give us the book. Give us Tiny's record." He jabbed a finger at Lucian. "You have been changing names. Show us the truth," he spat wetly. The standoff made Lucian feel the second major emotion shift, from compliance into acute dread that focused the entire night into a single decision. Madame Viral's hand tightened on the amulet. She looked at Lucian with a small, sharp edge to her eyes. "Lucian," she said one short word that contained both a command and an offer, "what will you do?" Her tone demanded an answer that was not neutral. Lucian's mind raced. He could hand the ledger over and reveal the marginal stamps, which would confirm the pattern of erasures and likely cost Madame Viral her influence. He could refuse and watch the book be seized by force, possibly burned. He could produce a substitute, a ledger with tampered pages intended to satisfy the crowd while keeping the original safe. Each option had consequences: discovery, ruin, or further complicity. He moved with the practical speed of someone making an irreversible choice. He took a leather satchel from beneath the table where he kept copies and small proofs of registration. He unrolled a worn page and set it on the table, then reached under the shelf and produced a second, smaller volume bound in cheap leather. "This is what the parish will find immediately," he told Jean Cavill, pushing the cheap ledger toward him. Jean Cavill snatched it and flipped it open. He glanced at the entries and frowned. The pages were complete enough to appear authentic from a quick look. The crowd began to relax its immediate anger at the visible proof. They muttered, "Is this the one?" Madame Viral allowed a thin smile. "It will satisfy their immediate claim. But we must be certain. Lucian will produce the verified margins under oath before the parish." She phrased it as a ritual of due process rather than a delay. Jean Cavill peered at Lucian. "You swear?" he asked, voice rough. Lucian breathed out and felt the ledger's weight in his palm. He had a single final, private movement, while Jean Cavill and the others continued to inspect the cheap ledger. Lucian pulled a match and set a few edges of the original register alight in a hidden fold between pages, just enough to char the margins and make certain lines illegible. He did not speak. His hand did the speaking. The small flare licked the vellum and left a band of ash along the edge of the folio. A small, private panic rose in Lucian. The ash would testify that something had been destroyed, yet it would also obscure the most dangerous names. He tamped the flame into the inkwell and pressed the singed page closed. The charred margin would later read as accidental damage from a raid, not intentional concealment. He had preserved the ledger's core but sacrificed proof. He had decided to protect the system that had protected him. Outside, the crowd calmed enough to depart with the cheap ledger. Jean Cavill gripped Tyne's torn certificate and muttered promises to bring the matter before the parish the next morning. Lucian watched them leave, his body humming with the adrenaline of a man who had just made a choice that would follow him. Madame Viral rested a hand on his shoulder. "You did well," she murmured. It was not comfort. It was a reinforcement of the bond between them. The work had been completed. The ledger remained serviceable. Lucian felt a hollow relief and an inner fracture widen. The next morning, in a dim reading room years later, the esoteric researcher opened a ledger with ash, dark margins. The margins bore no easy answers. A stamped sigil repeated across pages, and notes in a single hand, neat, angular, ink-stained fingertips, recurred where names had been replaced. The researcher tracked that hand through different parishes and realized the pattern was systematic. The ledger told what Lucian refused to say aloud, that names had been erased not by accident but by a sequence of deliberate acts. The marginal sigils matched the matron's bronze amulet. The charred edge on page 60, two matched descriptions in a deposition from the parish book burnings. The esoteric researcher traced the ash, dark margins and found the torn certificate of teen folded between two pages, brittle but legible in the parts that mattered. The chapter closed on a concrete beat. The researcher tapped the torn certificate and slid it back between the ledger's pages, then replaced the cover and pressed the brass clasp until it clicked. The ledger remained intact, its margins haunted by ash and sealed by choices made in a storm, slick registry. Lucian's fate remained unrecorded in those margins, and the larger system of Eresha continued beyond the one night. The immediate conflict ended with the ledger leaving the registry and the torn certificate hidden for future hands to find. In the final instant, the ledger's clasp clicked shut and the candle stub guttered to a soft, smoking nub. The sound of the clasp was small, precise, and final. The room smelled of vellum and wet ash. Madame Viral slammed a sealed parish list onto the table and said, "Begin, now." Suspicion tightened Lucian Marchand's jaw as he straightened the ledger on his lap and lifted his bone-handled quill. He had thought the villagers' shout from the previous night would mark the limit of trouble. Instead, the manor produced a new command and new ledger work before midnight. The immediate conflict was clear. Madame Viral demanded forged baptisms that would erase a family's legal and spiritual lineage before dawn. Lucian heard the rasp of her cloak and saw the bronze amulet catch the candlelight. The parish list lay between them like a delivered sentence. Lucian kept his fingers where the ink stained his fingertips, and he did not answer at once. He was a provincial registrar. The ledger and the seal were his instruments. He knew the law's curves and the parish clerk's stamps. He also knew how a line on paper could redirect a child's legal identity. The memory of his hand pressing the quill too hard, as recorded in the earlier incident when a villager cried out at his door, returned as a physical ache in his palm. The registrar's duty and his suspicion about what Viral called severance collided in him. Madame Viral, Lucian, folding a corner of the open ledger with practiced care. These lists are sealed by the parish. Altering them will produce witnesses and records to track the change. His voice was low and exact. He named the mechanics and the risk to show he understood the work, not to beg. Viral's eyes narrowed. "I know the risks, Lucian," she replied, fingers counting names on an invisible line. "And I know you understand more than any man in this county." She did not smile. "You will begin with the Four family. Sever their line. Make it appear they were not baptized in parish A but in parish D. Remove the contamination. Start now." "Acolyte will deliver the lists." Her hand slid a folded list toward him. The paper smelled faintly of sealing wax and beeswax. Lucian opened his mouth and closed it. His internal scale shifted. Duty to the registrar's craft versus a growing duty to a private conscience. Suspicion hardened into a quiet duty to check procedure. Then duty gave way to a small, insistent dread as he realized the scale Viral intended. He reached for the list. An acolyte knocked once at the study door and entered with two sealed bundles. The acolyte's face was young and guarded. He set the bundles on the table and spoke in clipped tones, the parish rolls as requested. His hands trembled slightly when he placed them down, and Lucian noticed the tremor before he noticed the name on the topmost list. Lucian worked into the night in the makeshift scriptorium behind the manor study. The room smelled of damp paper and candle wax. A single guttering lamp left edges of shadow at the far wall. Viral recited the procedure in a slow, ritual cadence while Lucian wrote with the bone-handled quill. She specified not only which columns to change, but how to dye, stain certain margins, how to forge witnesses' flourishes, which parish moss and stamp marks to reproduce. Her instructions combined legal mimicry with small performative acts. She insisted he dip the quill in a trace of her scented sachet while copying one particular signature. "It binds the legal trace to the doctrine," she said. Lucian paused each time she gave a detail that knitted paperwork to ritual. He obeyed mechanically at first, then he began to feel another shift. From suspicion to reluctant compliance to a rising physical unease. He caught himself tapping his pen when she demanded a smear of blood for a blot. Lucian had ink on his fingertips already. He did not want the stain made literal. He folded corners precisely and lingered over capital letters to slow his hand. At one point he looked up and asked, "Madam Viral, why must the 4th child be placed in Parish D? They are not kin to your circle." The question was technical, not moral, framed as a clerk's query. Viral's face went still for a long moment. She set the hand-bound book she always clasped beside her palm on the table and leaned forward. "You ask, because you see only a name and a record." "Lucian," she said, "we see a lineage that carries an old sickness. The 4line will spread that sickness unless removed. Transfer the name. The child will belong to another household in the eyes of God and law. That is rebirth. That is order." Her voice tightened on the last 2 words. The acolyte slid a sealed bundle across the desk. Lucian slit the sealing wax with the dull edge of his pen and found a list of names, parish stamps, and a note in Viral's hand that read, "Begin at once." The act of breaking a wax seal felt like trespass to him. He copied entries, applying the brass seal to blank spaces and trimming strokes to match the parish clerk's hand. Each forged line took him further from any plausible deniability. As he worked, a third emotion moved through him. Constraint, the compulsion of obligation reinforced by fear of exposure. A villager's shout interrupted the room later that night. Someone had come to the service entrance, breath clouding in the courtyard, demanding Lucian's answer for a missing baptismal entry. The gate banged. Voices swelled outside. Lucian's pen faltered and spilled a thin ink line across the margin. He heard the man's voice, sharp and raw. "Lucian! What have you done to my child's name?" The question arrived like a physical blow. Viral rose, cloak whispering, and walked to the curtained parlor window. "Send them away," she ordered quietly, but her order included a command to her acolyte. The acolyte left with quick, nervous steps. Viral returned and said aloud, calmly, "Explain, it is a clerk's confusion. I will speak to them in the morning." Her composure created a new emotional shift in the room. The immediate panic of accusation receded into a colder, imposed calm. Lucian felt the panic release into a hollowed compliance. He tightened the ledger's cover and met Viral's gaze. In the courtyard, a man banged his fist against the gate. He shouted names. Lucian recognized the family, the 4-name repeated in his head. He had adjusted their records only hours before. The man demanded truth, not explanation. He was carried by violence and raw loss. He demanded the return of a legal identity. Lucian stood, sleeves rolled, and walked to the small service door to face the villager. He had to speak plainly. "Sir, I will look at the register with you at dawn," Lucian called through the gate. "Bring any witnesses and the baptismal candle stub if you have it." The villager spat and cursed, then called for neighbors. Steps and shouting multiplied. The gate rattled. The manor's servants retreated into dark thresholds. Lucian understood the stakes. He knew. This was not only an administrative question. The missing entry bore weight in the village's memory, in godparent duties, and in inheritance law. People would not accept a silent erasure. He felt a fresh shift from dutiful compliance to dread that the forgery would be discovered and that the discovery would trace back to him. He returned to the scriptorium with the ledger clenched like a thin plank. The esoteric researcher arrived before dawn, though he did not arrive as a researcher in the garb of scholarship. Lucian found him in the corridor with a portable lantern and a small stack of maps. The researcher moved with a steady, cataloging manner, speaking in measured sentences about physical evidence and margins rather than doctrine. Lucian had not asked for him. Viral had arranged the researcher's presence earlier. Lucian later realized, as another mechanism of control. "Lucian," the researcher said, showing a marginal note and tapping a point on an old map. "Behind the west wall of the registry there is a space not on official plans. I found a seam. We can open it." His voice carried the cool attention of someone who catalogued wrongness to understand it. Lucian felt an odd relief. The researcher's presence offered a different scale of purpose. Investigation rather than ritual enactment. They worked together to pry at the wall. The researcher held the lantern angled to show the seam. Lucian, who knew the registry's weight-bearing timbers, found a loose board and levered it free. The hidden chamber revealed shelves of bound books, stamped seals, and a ledger thicker than any civic record. The ledger lay chained to a ring in the shelf. The sight forced another emotion in Lucian, disbelief shifting to sharp comprehension. The ledger contained not erasures but reassignments. Names moved, slips pinned into other families' entries, annotations in a script he recognized as virals. They moved names between households. Lucian, reading aloud as his finger traced a page. Here, the 4 infant is crossed into the Martel household 2 years prior, and a baptismal sponsor added. This is organized an identity trade. His voice grew tight. He tapped the page until the paper quivered. The researcher did not further the emotional surge with platitudes. He catalogued. Look at the marginal stamps and the sequence of dates. They synchronized parish returns. Someone added black ink notations that match Mimi. Viral's hand. This is deliberate redistribution. He named facts. The facts reframed the earlier suspicion into evidence. Lucian's doubt shifted into a furious clarity. He felt exposed in a new direction. Not merely as Forger but as instrument in a larger mechanism. An acolyte returned unexpectedly and lunged at the ledger as if to seize it. His move was sudden and desperate. Lucian caught the arm and the ledger slipped, pages fanning. A loose page, half torn and marked with scorch edges, fluttered free and landed face up between them. Lucian saw his own surname on the list, his family's line slated for severance in 2 weeks. The name was written in the same ink and annotated with a small, neat cross. Lucian's hands trembled. He snatched the page and held it hard, his knuckles white. The emotions moved again, from clarity to personal terror to a fierce, immediate need to act. Lucian looked at Viral. Her face remained composed, but her eyes measured him differently now. You will not do this, Lucian, low and fast, the sentences clipped by the urgency. You will not sever my child, my sister, my line. You cannot sign our name away, he spoke with sudden, rough insistence that had not been present before. Viral closed the hand-bound book and stood very still. Lucian, you have always been loyal to law and to craft. You will do what you must. We are saving a future elite. Your family is part of the work. This is not personal. This is necessary. She used the word necessary as if the word could outweigh the paper's violence. The argument became a physical struggle of wills. Lucian tore at the ledger, fingers clawing at bound twine. Viral stepped forward and seized his wrist, her carved ring biting into his skin. They traded 3 rapid lines of speech between them. Lucian, let go. Viral, no, this is not lawful. Lucian answered. You forget what keeps you in your post, Viral warned. Acolytes in the doorway shifted and the researcher kept his hands near the shelf as if ready to secure evidence. In that burst of shouted exchange, Lucian made his decision. He forced the ledger from the shelf, tore out the page with his family's name, and crumpled it in his palm. He struck the acolyte with the back of his hand, seized a coal from the brazier, and scorched the corner of the torn page. The small black curl of ash fell onto his sleeve. Viral barked in order. The room's tension leapt to its peak. That beat was the chapter's pivot. Lucian pushed past her into the register chamber doorway and thrust the still, smoldering scrap toward the doorway opening. The flame died quickly, leaving a charred corner and a faint smoke that curled upward. Voices sounded at the manor gate, those of villagers drawn by the early commotion. Someone shouted that a torn page had been carried out. Lucian felt the heat of the brazier press against his ribs and heard his heart move fast but measured. Objects in the chamber clattered as servants dragged shutters closed and slammed doors. By dawn, the torn page had reached the village and rumor spread like oil on water. Villagers gathered at the manor gate, carrying candles and the stub of a baptismal candle. They demanded answers. Viral stepped to the borrowed threshold and enacted a cover story. She spoke with solemn voice and produced a carefully worded statement that shifted the blame to a clerk's error and suggested a procedural investigation. The researcher catalogued the torn ledger fragments and noted which pages the charred edge had consumed. Lucian, meanwhile, moved to protect his family. He stuffed the half-burnt birth certificate into the inner fold of his coat and wrapped it in an oilcloth. He knew when he had done so. He walked through the servant door under the noise of voices and the murmured prayers rising from the courtyard. His hands smelled of ash and old ink. He felt a low, complicated sense of reprieve because his immediate kin would not wake to find their paper changed that morning. The village pressed for cogent detail. A woman at the gate said, "Lucian, you must show the book. If my son's name is gone, he cannot inherit from his godfather." The researcher stepped forward and produced a marginal note he had copied earlier, showing discrepancies in parish stamps. He traded factual sentences with the villagers and pointed out specific mismatches in dates and seal impressions. The exchange shifted the villagers' anger into suspicion toward the manor rather than toward Lucian alone. Virel, forced to act, moved quickly to draft a legal reconciliation that would placate the villagers and temporize the inquiry. She handed the researcher a sealed bundle of documents to begin an internal review and instructed the steward to call a distant magistrate. The steward executed the order in clipped, efficient steps. The action scrambled the village's immediate demand into a slower legal machine. The emotional temperature changed from enraged to anxious patience. Lucian watched Virel marshal the cover-up. He observed her count names on fingers, tilt her head, and keep still before delivering doctrine. He catalogued each motion in his mind as if marking pages in a ledger. Her theatrical calm, the acolyte's quick compliance, the researcher's neutral lists. The factual record hardened into an accusation against organized manipulation. Lucian felt another shift in himself, from protective furtiveness to a steady intent to document wrongdoing for a larger exposure. He moved to the scriptorium and wrote a marginal note in a private hand, detailing the ledger's hidden chamber and the names reassigned. For a moment in the morning light, Lucian thought of his earlier life as a clerk who took pride in exact handwriting. He felt shame along with relief and anger. He had been part of a system that pretended legal neutrality while trading identity. The discovery of his own family's name on the ledger reframed earlier nights as a pattern rather than a single error. He resolved to hide what he could and to provide evidence outside the manor's reach. He slipped the charred half of the birth certificate under the floorboard of his small chamber and then retrieved it, wrapping it carefully and pushing it into the lining of his coat. He made a note to meet the researcher later at an alley behind the cloister where the scholar said he kept copies of marginalia. Lucian planned to give the researcher a list of names and the particulars that would make a legal case. He felt fear returning but tempered by a quiet determination to act. As the crowd thinned and the manor resumed a hesitant routine, Lucian stepped through the servant passage, coat damp from the wet morning air. He carried in his pocket the half-burnt certificate and the smeared ink evidence of his late night work. Virel watched him with an expression that contained both appraisal and new calculation. The chapter closed with a concrete motion. Lucian withdrawing through the narrow door, the certificate warm in his hand as he stepped into the lane where the researcher's lantern had been left, and the manor gate thudding shut behind him. The small fight in the register chamber had been resolved. The ledger was damaged, a torn page out in the village, and the manor spinning a cover story. The immediate conflict, Lucian's choice between obedience and protection of his family, ended with his action to remove the evidence and to seek an ally. The larger pattern remained. Names moved as if they were goods, and Madame Virel kept building a structure that depended on clerks who would bend the law. Lucian did not know how far the ledger's trade reached, but he now knew he could not be merely its scribe. He walked away with soot on his sleeve and the smell of burned paper in his coat. He had shifted from suspicion to compliance to panic and now to a pragmatic resolve. The torn certificate in his hand would be both proof and risk. He had chosen to protect his kin with a small, concrete action that would shape the next confrontation. A clandestine meeting, copies of marginalia, and the slow turning of legal wheels. The chapter ends on that motion, Lucian slipping away through the servant door, certificate concealed, as voices rose again at the manor gate. Villagers shoved the manor gate aside and hauled the ledger across the slick stones, rain flinging off the cover as they dropped it on the flagstones. A woman thrust forward, rain flattening her hair, and shouted, "Lucian! Restore my child's name!" The registrar's quill trembled in his hand beneath his cloak. Suspicion drove the esoteric researcher forward. He stepped between the crowd and the ledger to read the page first. Within those first moments, the central problem was plain. Listed names had been altered and whole lineages erased, and the villagers had brought the proof to the matron's door. The crowd's demand made the stakes concrete. The village foreman pressed his palm to the ledger. "Show us the entries," he said. "Show us what you did with our births." Madame Virel appeared on the manor steps. Cloak wet at the hem, and did not move to touch the book. Lucian stood beside the ledger, shoulders narrowed, his spectacles hammered by rainfall. The researcher noted Lucian's ink, dark fingertips, and the bone-handled quill tucked at his waist. Those details explained where suspicion would fall. He moved to the makeshift registry table as the villagers forced space. Lucian opened the ledger with fingers that did not seem to find sleep. The esoteric researcher watched him lift a sealed parish page. Watched the registrar's hand hesitate over a name that had once been printed in a tidy hand and now showed an obvious, heavier stroke. Doubt came next. Lucian's jaw worked. He rubbed a thumb across the ink smear and looked at Madame Virel before lowering his eyes. The researcher catalogued the sequence with quick notes. Date, parish stamp, signature, marginal cipher. The crowd called names. A mother said, "My child was baptized here." "You wrote something else." Her voice cut across the courtyard. The village foreman forced Lucian to read aloud. Lucian's voice was small. "Jean-Baptiste, son of Marcel Renaud." He began and paused as his pen tip grazed a darker press where a syllable had been removed. The mother jabbed a finger at the line. "You crossed it out," she said. "You put a stranger instead of my son's father." Lucian folded a paper corner and tapped the ledger twice, a nervous habit. The researcher felt the first emotion shift undercut the opening suspicion. Suspicion moved to doubt, then to a sharp, physical fear when Lucian's hand shook visibly. The esoteric researcher recorded a concrete detail from an earlier night that matched the ledger. The bone-handled quill bore a nick along its shaft and a tendon of dried tobacco embedded near its ferrule. He remembered hearing the villagers earlier shout outside the registrar's door. That shout was now answered in public. The researcher did not narrate feelings. He listed facts and watched the way facts rearranged power. A villager spat. "Madame Virel, answer." Madame Virel descended the steps with small, measured motions. She placed both hands on the ledger without touching the open lines and spoke. "Let order be shown." Her voice did not seek pity, it sought obedience. Madame Virel produced a small bronze amulet and set it on the ledger's margin. The esoteric researcher recorded the amulet's engraving. A looped cipher not local to the parish, a shallow stamped impression that matched a faint sigil seen in a previous register. "The village foreman, who gave you that seal?" Madame Virel counted names on her fingers as if weighing them. Lucian swallowed. The crowd tightened. A boy began to cry. The first external event since the opening, Madame Virel's ritual authentication, forced the scene to move. Madame Virel worked with a sequence she had prepared. She cut the wax seal on a tied parcel, produced a stamped certificate, and slid it toward the foreman. "This is sponsored authority," she said. "The patron seal legitimizes any correction for the greater good." The foreman banged the ledger. "Who is the patron?" he demanded. Lucian looked at Madame Virel and then to the researcher, and something like a panic flared in his fingers. The second emotion shift arrived. Doubt hardened into fear in Lucian, while the researcher moved from suspicion toward cautious clarity. Every forged line bore repeated, deliberate pressure and a matching, illicit cipher. The esoteric researcher leaned and turned the ledger's margin. He found the faint sigil pressed under the binding and lifted it into the light. A stamped cipher, a patron mark, and a set of initials not belonging to any local family. He traced the pressed lines with a glove, detecting intentional alignment across several entries. "There is a cipher here," he said, voice low and precise. "It ties these changes to a hand outside this parish." Lucian's fingers scraped at the ledger as if to erase his own memory from the paper. The parish priest stepped forward, his collar damp. "We did not authorize this," he said. "Our registry cannot be altered without process." His tone held anger and personal shame in equal measures. The crowd answered with questions that became accusations. A villager rushed the table and flipped to another page. The esoteric researcher found a marginal note faintly scrawled in the same hand as the altered lines. A note of an instructed erasure and an order to seal the lineage. The foreman seized the ledger and thrust it toward Madame Virel, voice tight. "You ordered erasures for an elite project," he said. "You stole our names." The matron did not flinch outwardly. She kept her hands still and allowed the accusation to hang. The third emotion shift in the scene rippled in the crowd. Certainty split into factional fury and fear for those whose names were gone. Voices rose. The defiant mother struck the table with both palms. "My son is not erased." She shouted, "Lucian, tell us what you wrote." Lucian set his spectacles on the page and recited, but the ledger revealed deliberate alterations. strokes heavier than ink could explain, and seals pressed into the fold. The esoteric researcher read aloud a marginal cipher and its recurring pattern. This mark is not parish. It matches a collector's stamp I saw on a ledger from a town 2 days' carriage away, he said. It ties this manor to outside authority. That disclosure functioned as a mid-chapter twist. A local forgery now presented evidence of a wider design. The village foreman raised his voice. If this is a broader scheme, who benefits? He demanded. Madame Viral responded with an ordered calm. Those who seek purified lineage benefit, she said. Those who accept it gain protection and a new order. The researcher wrote the words down, not to pity but to map cause and effect. A man near the gate began to shout that the manor had sold children's names to a patron for favor and grain. Others defended the matron, saying she brought charity and work. The crowd split. Alliances revealed themselves in plain speech. Lucian's hands tightened around the ledger. The esoteric researcher watched him decide. Lucian's inner conflict played outward. He glanced at Madame Viral for permission, then at the mother who reached for her child's name. He tapped the quill against the wood 3 times and murmured, "I did what I was told." The murmured confession altered the tenor of the scene. It was small but decisive. The foreman answered with a rapid exchange. "You did what you were told." "You changed names? Answer Lucian!" Lucian inhaled and then said, "I believed I was preventing harm." That line sparked anger and disbelief in equal measure. The esoteric researcher recorded how the crowd reacted physically. Fists, trembling shoulders, a woman covering her face. He noticed a secondary clue in Lucian's ledger. A torn receipt folded into the spine with a patron's stamp and an ink note indicating payment for registry amendments. The receipt mentioned an outside noble by initial and a town name the matron had not named. The researcher's mind mapped a chain. Matron, patron, forged seals, and registrars instructed to rewrite lineage. He did not pronounce moral judgment. He archived evidence. Madame Viral moved closer to the ledger, palms hovering. She spoke to Lucian with a cadence that cut the crowd into silence. "Lucian, show them the proof of corruption elsewhere," she said. "Show them the families that endangered the village." Lucian's throat worked. The esoteric researcher saw a single, decisive choice assembling. Lucian could either defend the matron and continue to alter names, or he could break with the doctrine and expose the patron. The crowd leaned forward. The defiant mother stepped closer and told Lucian, "You must fix this. You must be the one to put it right." Her demand was public and personal. Lucian shifted and pulled a page free. The esoteric researcher watched him hold it as if it were a confession. He could see the ink stain at the corner where the quill had cut deeper in a hurry. Lucian placed the page down and, with a short, sure motion, tore it from the binding. The courtyard filled with a sharp sound, a page rending, and then a silence so sudden people inhaled audibly. The torn page fluttered in a gust from the clearing sky and fell between the mother's boots and the foreman's. The action became the chapter's small cliffhanger. Would Lucian destroy evidence, or would he expose it? Lucian's answer arrived in the same movement. He set the torn page on the table, and when the foreman demanded a decision, struck a match and held it to the paper's edge. Flames took the corner quickly. Black smoke threaded up and the scent of singed vellum stung nostrils. The matron's eyes narrowed. The defiant mother leaned forward and slapped the match from Lucian's hand. "No!" she cried. "Stop him!" Hands closed on the ledger. Someone grabbed Lucian's sleeve. The esoteric researcher reacted by reaching for the torn fragment and pulling it free from the small blaze, so that ash did not remove evidence. The researcher's action became a physical intervention in the choice. The climax assembled in 3 rapid beats. First, Lucian, under pressure, did one of 3 things. He could rip, confess, or burn. He had already torn. Second, he faltered at the flame and let the torn fragment remain half, charred as the mother seized it. Third, Lucian spoke with a voice that no longer avoided eye contact. "I will confess," he said. "I will tell what names I altered and who paid for it." The courtyard shifted. Madame Viral stepped back as if hit. The village foreman barked, "Then tell us now." The ensuing exchange became a compact argument with fast, raw lines. "Lucian, how many? Enough to change more than this village. Who is the patron?" "I do not know the full name." "Who sent the seal?" "A courier from the north, a man with a crest." The rapid back and forth gave the moment its required intensity. Lucian delivered a short, specific confession. He named parishes, listed dates, and admitted the ledger carried stamped ciphers linking to estates outside the valley. He explained the method. Sealed envelopes delivered with orders, a brass stamp pressed under the ledger's binding, payments recorded in a ciphered receipt. People listened and reacted physically. Some staggered, some laughed in disbelief, some reached for stones. Madame Viral did not deny the technique. Instead, she offered a doctrinal explanation about purification and new order. Her calm explanation did not satisfy more than a few. The crowd surged. A group moved to seize her. Others protected her in a cluster of arms and voices. The manor's authority began to crumble visibly. When the ledger's remaining pages were torn and scattered, the esoteric researcher gathered fragments into a small box beneath a lamp later that evening. He catalogued the half-burned leaf, the forged receipt, and the pressed cipher. Lucien sat across from him, shoulders curved, ink-stained fingers folded, and the researcher watched each twitch. "Lucien, I thought I was saving them," and lifted his chin only slightly. The researcher did not offer consolation. He placed each fragment under numbered tags and recorded the evidence. The defiant mother approached and, without theatrical words, said to Lucien, "You must answer in court." Her voice contained anger and a precise, practical demand for legal accountability. The manor's immediate collapse produced concrete consequences. Some villagers detained Madame Viral while others helped her flee through a wet back lane. Her cloak snagged on a nail and left a tear. The village foreman organized a deputation to the magistrate. The parish priest announced he would take legal steps to restore names, and he summoned witnesses. The esoteric researcher copied the forged cipher and then sealed his notes in a portfolio, knowing the pattern would likely appear in registers across the region. He recorded the names of 2 neighboring parishes that had similar marginal impressions in other documents he had examined. He could not declare a moral verdict from there. He could only point to the mechanism. Authority abused through sealed patronage, registrars enlisted to rewrite legal identity. That evening, under a single lamp in the manor's empty archive, the esoteric researcher catalogued testimonies. He recorded the defiant mother's statement, Lucien's confession, and the foreman's inventory of seized pages. Madame Viral's whereabouts remained uncertain. Her bronze amulet and hand-bound book had vanished from the table. The researcher photographed the burned edges and transcribed the receipt cipher into an index. He also noted the unexpected twist that altered the earlier picture. A servant's name written in the margins linked a local house to the courier who had delivered the stamped envelopes. That servant's testimony suggested not only elite ambition, but also the involvement of a middleman working under orders. The final paragraphs resolved the immediate conflict and set a practical closure. The magistrate arrived 2 days later, took custody of the ledger fragments, and ordered a temporary registry to be established under the parish priest's supervision. Lucien agreed to testify and surrendered his quill and seal. His keepsake locket remained under his shirt, an item the researcher later recorded to explain the registrar's personal attachments. Families submitted claims with witnesses and baptismal recollections, and the parish priest recorded provisional entries based on witness testimony and surviving baptismal rites. The esoteric researcher packaged his notes and the stamped cipher for transmission to a provincial archive, leaving specific instructions about cross-referencing other parishes' registers. When the esoteric researcher closed his notebook that night, he did so not with a speech but with a deliberate act. He filed the torn fragments in a labeled box and locked it in the manor's archive under a brittle wax seal. He left a line of inked instruction pinned to the ledger. The magistrate must examine the patron initials and the courier routes. Lucien, having made his public confession and surrendered the ledger's instruments, walked away with a small group of villagers to repair the registry room's bent nails and damp shelves. Madame Viral's flight left a stain on the manor's reputation that would require legal process and time to settle. The researcher closed the door on the archive and took with him a final, concrete observation. Forgeries had required 2 things: access to legal implements and the cooperation of a registrar who could write new lines into the book. And both were present in the manor that morning. The chapter ends with an immediate situational beat. As the esoteric researcher descended the manor stairs, He saw the defiant mother handing a reclaimed baptismal slip back to her child. The child read his restored name aloud and held it up like a small claim. The researcher noted the child's steady mouth and the village foreman's furrowed brow. He recorded the names, the receipts, the stamped cipher, and the list of couriers. That inventory closed the chapter. The ledger had been torn, some names restored, some evidence seized, and a wider pattern revealed. The final image is concrete, a mother standing in the rain, the child's reclaimed slip in his small fist, while a box of fragments waited in the archive for the magistrate's table the next morning.